one. Noswaith dda. Hopefully we are live. There's a comments area. If you're able to see us and hear us, please leave a message very quickly in the comments area so we know there are people out there. And in a minute or so, I will let Katherine and Alice begin. Lovely to see you all. Good evening from Venice. Philip is in the house.
Hooray! That's great. If we're reaching Venice, it must be going okay.
There we go. Noswaith dda. Noswaith dda, Leslie. Just to double check, you can hear us and see us. There's a little delay, so don't worry. Noswaith dda. Hopefully we are live. There's a comments area. If you're able to see us and hear us, please leave a message very quickly in the comments area so we know there are people out there. That'll be me. And in a minute or so, I will let Katherine and Alice begin.
Like an experimental sound recording, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Hearing yourself back is always a worry. There we go.
I know.
Absolutely.
I've got rid of that annoying person. Okay. Oh, hello. Okay. Oh, hi from Cardiff. Hello, Michael. Hello, Jan. Hello, Winnie. Hello, Bethan. Noswaith dda. Loud and clear. Very loud and clear.
That's all right then.
Okay. Well, it looks like we've got people coming on both. So I'm going to dip out now and leave you with Alice and Katherine. And I will be coming back a bit later. The comments area seems to be working, which is fantastic. If you've got any questions for Alice or Katherine, please pop them in as we go. Don't leave it to the end. About 15 minutes or so before the end of the call, about 7:45 or so, I'll jump back and we'll use the remaining time to look at those questions. So feel free to post them during the conversation. But I shall leave you now in the capable hands of Katherine and Alice. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Matthew. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Matthew and all the team at Estyn Allen for having Alice and I, and also lots of Crime Cymru members. We've been taking part in events. So we're very excited to be here this evening to talk about historical fiction. And we're both wearing red jumpers without coordinating because we're just on such the same page, Alice and I. So we just dress the same as well. But what we thought we'd do to start this evening is introduce each other, which is a nice thing to be able to do, to talk to a writer you admire and to say, you know, what you love about their work. So I'm going first. We've decided very democratically. And I'm going to introduce Alis Hawkins. It's my great pleasure to introduce Alis Hawkins this evening. Alice grew up on a dairy farm in Cardiganshire in West Wales. And though she now lives on the border between England and Wales, she is very much present in Wales, both physically through her work with Crime Cymru. We're going to talk a bit about Crime Cymru tonight, but also creatively through her writing. And I think it's fair to say that without Alice, there wouldn't be Crime Cymru at all. Alice is one of 3 writers who decided that there was so much good stuff going on in the crime writing world in Wales that authors should band together to get the word out there, to tell everyone what we were doing, but also to support each other as well. And Alice was the first chair of Crime Cymru. She's sort of set us going, and she's currently the co-chair with Matt Johnson. And she's been a tireless champion of Crime Cymru since the beginning. And I think it's important to say that she does far more than just shout about crime writing. Alice actually gets things done. And without her commitment, her energy and her ambition, we wouldn't be doing half the things that we are today as an organisation, including, I must tell you, the amazing Crime Cymru Festival. This began life digitally this year during the pandemic, and it will be taking place in Aberystwyth in the spring. And we are very excited about that. Watch this space. I first got to know Alice's writing through her Tyvi Valley Coroner series, which we're going to talk about tonight. It's set in West Wales in the 1850s, and it has a really fascinating detective duo, a really interesting, unusual pair. You've got Harry Probert Lloyd, who is a reluctant member of the local gentry who is losing his sight. And he's partnered with John Davis, who is a solicitor's clerk looking to get on in the world, but fighting the challenges of his status. Now, this setup would be interesting enough on its own, but the series has a really interesting added element of fascination, I think, because Harry is a coroner, and this is a peculiar, unusual, endlessly interesting position within the Victorian criminal justice system, and I'm interested in that as a reader and a writer. And Alice will tell us about that today, which is fantastic. And he's often at odds as a coroner with the new police force and also the magistrates. So there's lots of tension going on in these novels, and there are just so many layers in them in terms of history, social justice, gender equality, and the politics of language, because the world Alice creates is just so compelling. And not only does she set books in the 1850s, but the other fictional universe she spends time is the medieval period, which is so different. And that's always so interesting as well. So I'm just so excited to talk to you about that tonight, Alice, as well. And also a new series in a new time and a new place. So we'll get to that as well, I hope. So Alice, hooray!
Oh, Kath, thank you so much. Wow, what an introduction. That's just amazing. I'm amazed to hear that that's all me. You know, I was thinking, who is this person? Gosh, this is an amazing person. Oh, it's me, God. Well, and I shall now do similar. So in talking about the lovely Kath, I'm going to call her Kath. I mean, you'll know her as Katherine Stansfield, but we amongst ourselves and in Crime Cymru, we know her as Kath. So Kath grew up on the wilds of Bodmin Moor, and after coming to Wales to study, lived for many years on the equally wild west coast of Wales, though she now lives in Cardiff. Kath was one of the very first crime authors to contact us when we launched Crime Cymru back in 2017. And she's been a complete stalwart for us ever since. She's been variously our secretary, brilliant panel member at festivals, always provides wise counsels, particularly for me. I mean, I will panic every now and again and ring her up and say, I don't know what to do, Kath. Tell me what to do. And this particularly happened with the festival, because as well as running a festival this year and next, one digital and one in the real world, we decided also in the same year to launch our inaugural first novel competition.
Hooray!
And I basically dumped that on Kath. She volunteered to be part of that, and I said, please, will you chair that committee? So she did, and she has done a brilliant job of that. And we're about to start sifting through all the various entries, which is a fantastic thing. Anyway, as a writer, Kath's equally versatile. She's a published poet. She runs very well-received crime fiction workshops, which I know some of the people here tonight will have been on. She's been a literary fund fellow in the past, and as well as all of that, she writes award-winning novels. She's currently got 2 very different crime series in publication. So there's 3 novels in her Cornish Mysteries series, featuring the brilliant and unique pairing of Anna Drake and Shelley Williams, 2 very, very different women from opposite ends of the social spectrum. And also a gaslight. A gaslight fantasy was a new thing for me.
Me too.
Maybe Kath will explain what gaslight fantasy means in a bit. Anyway, the gaslight fantasy crime trilogy that she's written with her partner under the name of D.K. Fields, and that's set in the fictional and brilliant world of Ffenest. Have I pronounced that correctly, Kath? Yeah, there we go. I always want to say Ffenest, like Welsh window. Anyway,
yeah,
window onto a different world.
It is. It comes from the Italian word for window.
Oh,
so
there you go.
You're very close.
And it is definitely a window on a different world. But her Cornish Mysteries, which is what we're really going to be discussing this evening, because we're talking about historical fiction, they see Anna and Shelley investigating crimes which are based on real events in Cornish history. But they also involve quite a good dash of Cornish folklore. So if you think of Kath's books in terms of Sherlock Holmes meets The X-Files meets Daphne du Maurier, you wouldn't be too far out. Her mysteries are wonderfully atmospheric, meticulously researched, and frankly, they're a joy to read. I mean, I wasn't at all surprised after reading the first of them, Falling Creatures, to know that Kath is also a published poet, because her prose is just gorgeous. Also, Shirley and Anna are one of the most interesting detective pairings that I've come across, especially in historical fiction, which is not overburdened with female main protagonists. So I'm absolutely delighted to have the chance to talk to Kath about those 3 novels in depth this evening.
Brilliant. Well, great. Thank you. That's very nice. It's a lovely way to start an event.
The Mutual Admiration Society.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and hopefully that's given people who didn't know us already an idea of what we're interested in and what we write. And there is sort of uncannily quite a lot of crossover in terms of what we're interested in and how our different areas that our novels address. And that was quite spooky when I first met you, to realise that and think it's not just me that's interested in the start of the police force in Britain, you know, there's someone else's as well. And we decided we'd get started tonight by thinking about our first historical fiction novels personally, and what they were and what drew us to writing about the past and particular periods, and also what we learnt really along the way. I don't know about you, Alice, but I feel like with every new book I'm writing, even one in an ongoing series where I've spent time in the same period, you know, for a long while, I still feel like I'm learning an awful lot about that period, but also how to write about it as well. Do you want to tell us a bit about your start in historical fiction, where you kind of see your starting point?
Yeah, no, sure, absolutely. Well, as you mentioned in the introduction, I started in the medieval period, in the 14th century. I've always been fascinated by the 14th century. It seems to me it's the period in time where you can just about see the beginnings of the modern world, but it's still recognizably very different. It's pre-industrial, but they had a lot of technology. And it seems to me that the 14th century is the most human-shaped century. It's like after any kind of apocalypse, that's what we would default to, because that's what you can do with human power. So I've always been fascinated by the 14th century. It also was the century where everything happened. It was literally apocalyptic. I mean, plague, war, famine, they were all there. So I loved the 14th century. And I started off, in fact, not writing crime. So my first novel, historical novel, was a kind of split time, half set now and half set in a fictitious medieval university city, which I called Solster, in the 14th century. And the historical bit is about the building of that historical college, a bit like one of the Oxford colleges, and the contemporary bit is about what's happening there now. And like all split time things, you have to solve a problem in the past to move forward in the future. So that got me onto the kind of historical writing merry-go-round, if you like. And I realized, writing that dual narrative, that actually I liked writing the historical aspects an awful lot better than I liked writing the contemporary. So after that book, I abandoned any pretense at writing contemporary stuff, and all my novels have been historical. So there's another historical one, which also features Solster briefly, The Black and the White, which is set during the Black Death. And then I kind of fast forwarded to the Teifi Valley in the mid-19th century. Because I'd always wanted to write a book about the Rebecca riots. So yes, then I thought, right, I'll then scurry back to my beloved 14th century, but I fell in love with the mid-19th century in West Wales, where, I mean, I'm writing about the area I grew up in, but I knew virtually nothing about the history, because we didn't learn that at school. We learned about the Romans and the Normans and the Tudors and all of that. So learning about Welsh social history in the area that I grew up in, oh God, I just loved it. And I thought there are so many stories here. So hence the Teifi Valley Coroner series, in which there are now 4.
In their full glory.
In their full glory. So,
and do you think that's so interesting, that the idea that actually the place where you grew up, I felt the same in terms of growing up in Cornwall, that they're realising latterly, you know, as an adult, that there was that you knew nothing about the area we were from, but you could have said a lot about Henry VIII, for instance, if prompted. And do you think that is that where historical fiction comes in, as both a writer but also a reader as well? Do you think it has a role to play in filling those gaps?
I definitely do. I mean, all the history that I like, and certainly that I liked as a kid, I got from between the covers of paperbacks, because I've never been interested in political history or the history of monarchs or military history, which is what you learn at school, this battle, that king, that act of parliament, dull. What I wanted to know was, how do people live? And that's what I was investigating, because again, what I write about is ordinary people. I mean, Harry, although he's a coroner and he's the son of the squire, he is investigating the deaths of ordinary people. And that's been absolutely fantastic. And to learn about the area that I grew up in, you know, literally the ancestors of the people that I went to school with, because I'm not from that area. My parents are from Pontypool. So has just been brilliant. And to see when we moved there in the 60s, you can still see the kind of remainders of that way of life. It's all gone now completely, but there were attitudes, there were practices and what have you in the farming community then, which had come straight down from centuries before. And that I found that really thrilling in a way. I mean, were you the same with Cornwall? I mean, obviously you've been looking in the same way as me, really, looking at what was life really like. And in your particular case, looking at actual crimes, actual events. Did you know any of those events before you started looking?
I knew some of them. So the just to wave a book cover, so it's nice to have a visual aid, isn't it? So yeah, this book, which you very kindly mentioned already. So this is the first in my historical crime series. That's about a real murder that took place, and the reason I knew about it is because the place where it happened in 1844 was just up the road from where I grew up. So it was one of the most famous thing to happen in that area. And the reason that it was famous is because it became it was a very well reported story in the day at the time. So it was reported first locally and then it reached the national newspapers, and it was a very grisly, gory crime that attracted a lot of widespread attention, and it was about the death of a young woman at the hands of what was reported to be a man. And I think to reflect on that narrative on a day like today, in terms of what in the UK we've been hearing the horrors of Sarah Everett's experience and the issues that raises about male violence against women, that is incredibly current and real and present. But of course, I was writing about an event that took place in 1844 that has so many parallels, because unfortunately those stories are persistent. And so I think that that's one reason why I was drawn to write about that particular crime, because it seemed to have so much, sadly, so much contemporary relevance. So that's what started this series off. And then, of course, once you've got the parameters of a series, you've decided this is where my series takes place, this is the locale, this is the time period. You know, if you start in 1844, you're going to stick around that time unless your next book is 20 years hence and your characters have aged a great deal. And so that set the footprint. And then I, of course, as you know, one thing leads to another, and you read one book and you think it's going to tell you one thing, and actually you find some other great tidbit, and that sends you off a different way. The first book led me to lots of other real stories and real experiences that sort of guided me through that. But the first novel that I wrote, the first historical novel, this one, The Visitor, is also set in Cornwall, but it takes place in the 1880s and 1936. So it's interesting that my first historical novel, like yours, moved between time periods. And it's hard, isn't it? It's a hard way to write historical fiction. And it's interesting you say, because obviously now you know that it's the past you want to write about rather than that present day. But I wonder if you'd be tempted to write another time slip with the two strands again, or actually if you've realized, however many books in that you are, that actually that is quite tricky.
Yeah, it's not so much the technical trickiness as I think what I've realised about the way I write is that there's not enough what you might call psychic distance between me and contemporary people. There's not enough separation between me as the writer and them as the character, and they always become a little bit like me. Whereas if they're in the past, then they can't be me.
Right.
I mean, I've kind of compounded that by pretty much uniquely writing, not uniquely, just writing about men. So nearly all my protagonists have been young, very young men, in fact, probably because I've got two sons. And I'm now thinking about my next series and writing a woman. But I think setting your novels in the past gives you that necessary distance between you and your characters. One thing I was going to ask you from the things you were just saying, do you feel that historical novels work best when there's an obvious resonance between them and what's happening in the present? Or do you think that actually what you referred to earlier on, we need to be reflecting what was happening then, or is it somehow the sweet spot where you do both?
Oh, that's such a good question, because it's very easy, I think, for historical fiction to become didactic and to have a message, and for the thing that you're reflecting on it to become quite trite, and to potentially use an event from the past, potentially real people, real experiences, and then make use of them for our own ends. And we do that, I think, as writers, but I think it's quite a potentially problematic area, and it can, we think about appropriation, but also things just not doing the past events justice as we try and make our point about the present. So I think it can be easy to try and make that connection too tight and blunt, and then it all falls apart. But then at the same time, I think that actually we are 21st century writers, and it's impossible to distance ourselves from what preoccupies us in the present, and that however we look at an event, experiences of the past, say the 1850s, in your case, the 1840s, in mine with our series, how could we look at those without the lens of who we are, the product of our circumstances and that sort of thing? So I think that that's a kind of negotiation that I'm always really conscious of. And I think what I've tried to do is to trust myself a bit more as I've gone on, that there are things that I am preoccupied by, that I'm conscious of or not, and that will influence what I choose to write about in the past. And those inflections, connections will appear because they're there anyway, and not to try and force it or seek to be too didactic. But of course, a reader with any kind of fiction, we never know what our reader's bringing to that text, do we? And how we might actually be writing about something that we thought was very kind of neutral, this was just the Corn Laws, and then actually someone says, oh my goodness, because of what has happened in my family or what's happening at work, they see a parallel. And I think that's one of the joys of fiction generally, but it's particularly powerful with historical fiction, because you often don't know what's going to connect with people. It can be quite surprising. No. I mean, how do you feel about that question, the excellent question you asked me, that do you think historical fiction works better if you can see that more overt parallel, and are you aiming for that or not?
I'm never aiming for that, partly because, as you know, Kath, I don't really plan my books. So I'm never quite sure what I'm aiming for, apart from the satisfactory resolution of a murder investigation. It's not quite so true to say I don't plan. I mean, any historical writer, you must know what kind of historical backdrop that you're working against. And what I've done in the Typee Valley series is to take a very specific set of events in each book and set my fiction against the backdrop of that. So in None So Blind, it's the Rebecca riots. In the second one, In Two Minds, it's Welsh immigration to America. In the third one, Those Who Know, it's two things really. It's how coroners got elected, because Harry's getting elected at that point, but also the after effects of the Royal Commission into the State of Education in Wales in 1847. And then the most recent one, Not One of Us, I've kind of played a little bit fast and loose with West Wales history, and I've introduced the beginnings of the woolen industry, which actually started really at the end of the 1850s, beginning of the 1860s. I've kind of introduced that in the early 1850s in a completely plausible way. I mean, it could have happened the way I've done it. it. So I've always done quite a lot of research into what was going on and that aspect of things. And then I let my characters play out the story, the murder investigation or death investigation, because Harry's a coroner, that, you know, not all the deaths are murders, against that background. And then you see what the characters do. And I think I was saying to somebody the other day, actually, that I thought that I'd got away with not having anything to do with lockdown or COVID or any of that in my current book, Not One of Us. But when I read it for the nth time before sending it off to my editor, I realised, oh my goodness, I've written a book about fake news.
Oh.
Because I realised that lots of the characters in it are choosing to believe what they want to believe rather than the evidence. And I thought, yeah, see, I didn't get away with it. But then, like you were saying, there always are those resonances because we're human beings and we all live in the same kind of way. And the thing, history keeps repeating itself because nobody listens, you know. So I never set out to do that. But it is amazing what you find in your own work, those resonances that you find in your own work, isn't it?
Yes, and it can be quite spooky and unnerving in a positive way, but I suppose it often reveals, I think, the subconscious way that what's happening there, you know, that we think that we're very aware of what we're doing and like, yes, I'm in control of what's happening and I'm making the decisions, but once you actually see the finished text, it can be quite strange, you know, but I suppose that's reflecting our connection with it as writers. But it's interesting to think that, you know, if somebody picks up you know, any of our novels in 20 years time or 40 years time, that they will read them through the lens of their experiences in the way that we're writing them through the lens of our experiences. And I think that's one of the fascinating sort of telescopic things about historical fiction, is it's got that extra layer to it, is that we're looking back through our lens, and that creates all kinds of strange refractions and things like that. And it's endlessly interesting.
It is.
I think.
It is endlessly interesting. I mean, one of the things I was going to ask you is about what we actually choose to write about, because I think you've been braver than me, and you've gone for the female protagonists. I mean, when I was setting out to write None So Blind, I thought, right, it's got to be men because men had agency at the time, women didn't. And you have been much braver than me. So how did you come to that decision that you would actually have two female main protagonists?
Well, I think originally it sprang from the plot. So I wanted to write about this murder that had taken place on Bodmin Moor in 1844. That was factually the murder of a young woman. And a big aspect of that case, when I was reading about it, what really struck me was that she didn't really have anybody to defend her after she had been killed. She didn't have anyone to mourn her. She'd been abandoned by her family. She was really sort of betrayed by her female employer, the woman who employed her, and she was surrounded by men who were very keen to say that she was a flirt, that she had got above her station and she'd sort of got what she deserved. And that was very stark in the historical record. Those voices came through about her character and her, you know, her life really. And it was very striking and very sad. And I think what really motivated me was to think, well, I want to write about this real case, this real murder investigation. But I also want to do that for my way into that, my protagonist, my detective, to be somebody who mourns her, this woman who had been killed, Charlotte Diamond, somebody who fights for her and who cared about her. And so that's where it started from, was actually trying to, I could see there was a real void in the reporting of the victim's life. And I felt compelled, and this is what one can do in fiction, compelled to fill that void with some kind of entity, somebody who cared and would be motivated to find out the truth. And that it just, because of the balance of genders in the story already, because of the power dynamic in that particular locale, that person had to be a woman. And it just so it happened that as I was writing and this character came into being, she wasn't just a friend of the woman who had died. She was actually a lover or a would-be lover, that this was actually an intense romantic relationship, a physical relationship, if you believe the narrator. Maybe you shouldn't, couldn't say. But that's, so it kind of, the energy of that character and that she was a woman, and that she was going into this challenge, with a perceived lack of agency and lack of power, because she wanted to redress that balance herself. It was those sorts of things kind of created her. And then in terms of, there's another detective, her sort of turns out to be her detective partner, comes into being. They meet in this first case. Again, it seemed natural that Anna Drake would also be a woman, but I think that's because of the first character I'd created, Shilly, who tries to start investigating by herself and then needs Anna's help, and they come together, both got their own reasons. I think that one gave rise to the other, and I was interested in how they are both the same in that they're both women in this period, but they're also wildly different in terms of their social status, their knowledge of the world, their literacy. One can read, the other can't. So I also was interested to think about, it's easy to say, in this period, well, all women were subjugated and, impoverished and beaten and all these sorts of things. But of course, the reality is completely different. So I wanted the opportunity to explore women's experience in that period in quite different ways, I think. So that's sort of how they came into being. Of course, once you've got them both in your first book, unless one of them passes away, and I'm not revealing anything to say that they both make it out, then they're with you. Yeah. They're your characters, aren't they? And then your other decisions are impacted by those early ones. And I think, I'm not sure I thought too much about those early decisions. And I'm glad I didn't really. It was quite sort of intuitive. And obviously you felt quite strongly that you were going to have male protagonists, but I'm always interested in when Harry's blindness appeared in your mind or in his character, and whether or not you were working from a historical starting point with that element of his character, or whether or not that is just something that came to you from the ether.
It came to me as a plot device, to be perfectly honest, because Harry is not keen to be back in West Wales. He took part in the Rebecca riots, in a slightly, in a way that didn't necessarily do him much good. And he then really fled the country, went to Oxford, studied, and then has subsequently gone to London, trained as a barrister, and that's where he is, and doesn't particularly want to come back. Never wanted the life of a squire. This is one of the reasons he got involved in the Rebecca riots, which was essentially a working class, uprising, if you like. But now I needed to have something which forced him home. So something had to make him unable anymore to carry on being a barrister. So he either had to have a catastrophic accident, which stopped his mobility, meant he couldn't get about. That wouldn't really work in terms of an investigation because he needs to be able to wander about. So it was like, okay, he needs to be deaf or blind. And I realized that actually being deaf is much more socially isolating. He would find it very, very difficult to do what he needed to do if he was deaf. So I made him blind. But I didn't want him to be completely blind. And also, it's quite unusual that you would go completely blind at his age. So I did some research and worked out what kind of variety of blindness would be best for him and for me as the writer, and came up with macular degeneration, which means you lose your central vision, but retain peripheral vision. So as he says, I think at some point in the first book, None So Blind, I can see, but I can't look. So he is aware that things are there. He doesn't bump into the furniture. He can get about independently, but he can't see faces. He can't read. He can't see detail in any way. It's incredibly frustrating for him. But that's why I made him blind. Can I come back to something that you were mentioning just now? That business of the perception of the period. What people think it was like. How much are you as a novelist, because this is something I grapple with quite a lot, how much are you as a novelist challenging what people think the 19th century was like, And how afraid are you? Because again, I constantly worry about this, that people will think, well, that's not right. That's not, she hasn't done her research because that's not what it was like. You know, how do you kind of navigate that?
Oh, with great trepidation, I think, but it also gets to the heart, doesn't it, of people, the perception versus research, because as I'm sure, you know, you found out as well that, you know, we take our own baggage to a period, and then in researching, you can discover, oh my goodness, well, actually, I was completely wrong on that score. And that might be, so you discover a fact, a truth that you think, well, this is great, you know, this is going to really animate my historical fiction series. But then if you then take that back to the modern day reader and present them as, here is the past, what, you know, in terms of gender equality, whatever it might be, you're then working against the weight of assumption of belief and assumption about the past. And whilst the modern reader's presumptions may not be factually correct, as you have discovered in your research, actually the effort to disabuse them of that, or the act of that, can be very destabilizing and can, you know, yank your reader out of the wonderful world you've created. So you may be factually correct, but you are disruptive in terms of a perception of the past. And what do we go to historical fiction for? That sort of gets the heart. Do we go to it to be educated, to learn new things, perhaps to reappraise our understanding of the past, or actually do we go there to be reconfirmed in our belief of the past because that's the version of the past we're interested in? Because we're not historians, we're not presenting texts as this is historical fact, it is historical fiction, but the motivation of the reader and why they're coming to read your novel, I think, is a really, really interesting one. And it's a very difficult line to tread, I think. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but of course you're always going to have readers, and this is a good problem to have, who will come back to you and say, well, actually, I think you'll find in 1837 it was not possible to put this many nails in a horseshoe because this particular device hadn't been used. And we get things wrong, but I love those moments. I absolutely love them, and you know, I enjoy them. It's again, you're thinking about, well, does this matter? You think it matters? Whose version of the past are we thinking about here? I mean, how do you feel about it? I mean, it's a tricky one, isn't it?
It is a tricky one, and I think you're right to use the word destabilizing, and you do throw your reader off potentially. I think the way I've got around it, because I'm quite evangelical about the past, I want people to know I love the 19th century. I mean, I thought I didn't like it at all but I had to tell a story about the Rebecca riot, so I made myself find out about it, and I realized that pretty much everything I thought about the 19th century was wrong. So I've become quite evangelical about helping other people to see that maybe their preconceptions are wrong. And I think one of the ways that I've done that is to have my central characters kind of playing off against each other. Harry is quite an uncharacteristic mid-century man in a way. Not that there was, you know, the typical man. I mean, it's like saying, what's a typical 21st century man? Well, it depends what class they are, you know, how much education they've got, where they're from, I kind of initially conceived of John Davis, Harry's assistant, as a kind of everyman who could say, well, why are you doing that? What's this about? You know, to kind of be a foil for Harry. But of course, in the way that characters do, he refused to do that. It's like, excuse me, I'm a real person. I'm not doing your bidding. Thank you very much. But John, I suppose, John is much less keen to defy convention. So we've still got that. He's still questioning, well, why is Harry doing that? What's going on here? So John kind of represents, in his slight fearfulness of defying convention, he's a more representative, and I suppose what people think of as people in the 19th century. But he allows us to understand how and why Harry is different, I suppose. But it is interesting, this business of what a character's like. If I could just tell a quick story about John. So the latest book, Not One of Us, is set in 1851. And the big event that was happening in 1851 was the Great Exhibition in the Crystal Palace. which was then in Hyde Park, not in Crystal Palace. Anyway, the Crystal Palace was the exhibition centre, as it were. And if you're writing a book set in 1851, you have to include the Great Exhibition. There's just no excuse otherwise. So I sent John there. And when I sent him there, I realised I had no idea how he was going to respond to it. And it was very interesting seeing his response, because that was a way that enabled me to talk about what were people's responses to the Great Exhibition, because not everybody thought, oh, this is amazing, this is the future. Some people thought, dear God, this is the future. In the same way that we do, we look at the future and we think, AI, don't want to go there. Human implants, don't want to go there. And he was looking at the mechanization of agriculture and thinking, don't want to go there. So yeah, you are walking a tightrope all the time, aren't you? And you have to let your characters explain, I think, rather than, as you said earlier, being in a kind of didactic way. You've got to let your characters explain how they're interacting with their environment. I mean, is there anything you've got similar to the Great Exhibition which made you think, oh, I need to be careful about how I do this?
I could think of, but it's interesting when you were talking about having John, intending him as like a foil, that I think I've used the same technique now I think about it, but again, not consciously, which is that Shelley is your, if you like, perhaps what people might expect of a member of the labouring class. She's illiterate. Her worldview is incredibly narrow. Her vocabulary is very narrow. And actually, she's there to be the reader's way of navigating what is the other way of living, which is that of Anna Drake, who is the new thing, the new detective, the new way of thinking about the world and crime and observation and things like that. So I think that it's really funny that I as you were describing that, thinking about the duo that way, I thought that's exactly what I've done. And it's interesting, isn't it? And I think that's coming back to think about historical crime specifically, that's another reason why the duo is such an important dynamic, isn't it? And they work just as hard in historical crime fiction as they do in crime fiction, in terms of sharing not the burden exactly, but doing the heavy lifting in terms of helping the reader follow the case. What do we know? What don't we know? But also, what do I know about life right now? And what don't I know about life right now? That's a good point to go to questions. What don't I know about life right now? As a natural segue, as I'm just looking at the time. So I'm wondering if we come back to Matthew, who's here with us, who could let us know how things are going on the questions front, because we can't see that. So
no, I've got just the one at the moment, but if anyone else has got some questions, please pop them in the comments and we will have a look. Oh, another one's just popped up. But the first question we've got this evening could be to both of you. Does what you read influence your writing?
Ooh, good question. Very good question. I'm always very careful what I read when I'm writing. I don't read any 19th century fiction. Certainly not 19th century crime fiction, because I feel my style would be influenced, and possibly some of the things that I wrote about would be influenced. So yes, I mean, I think all writers are influenced by what they read. I mean, some for both good and ill. I mean, I'll read some books and I'll think, oh my gosh, right, mistake. I'm not doing that. How are they? That's a terrible. No, they don't. You're wrong. And then you read others and you think, wow, I am just inspired by the way this person has dealt with this particular thing, or the way they've structured their book. It's just, oh wow, I've got to learn from that. I mean, you never just lift what another writer has done, but sometimes something is it just blows you away so much. You think, right, I need to think how I am going to do that in my next book. What about you, Kath? You're nodding away.
Well, I think very similar, although I do tend to read 19th century fiction when I'm writing my neo stuff. Maybe that's not a good idea, but I find somehow it helps me just tune in a bit more. I think just because I'm often writing about farming communities, about people working on the land, about various, kind of working people, is that I often want to read lots of novels set or involving farmyards or dairies or fishermen, and just some of the language, the terminology, I find it's like a radio frequency. It kind of helps me tune in. But what I also find as well, I don't know about you, Alice, is that I get stuck in a rut in terms of my kind of language and use of expression. I can find myself being kind of a bit samey sometimes. You kind of get into a pattern, a bit tired and you've got to finish this book. And so sometimes then reading something completely different, it can just, it's like a sort of a recharge, and it can just kind of shake up my sentences, shake up my language, and it gives me a kind of a freshness, which can be really, really wonderful. But it's just, the question is being aware that you've reached the point you need it, like I need that recharge of some maybe some contemporary experimental fiction. Maybe that's what I need. So it's like both ends of the spectrum, I suppose.
Right. Yeah. Do you read contemporary newspapers of the time? I mean, are you on the British newspaper? Yeah. I found that tremendously. I mean, I'll kind of keep going back to that while I'm writing, because I find particularly the front pages with all the adverts and the public announcements so helpful, because
Absolutely.
There's nothing like an advert to tell you how people lived and what they thought and what they believed and what was important to them.
Yes.
Yeah, the front pages of newspapers in those days, which were all adverts for anybody who doesn't know, are just a treasure trove of social history. Fantastic.
Yes, and we're very lucky that they're so widely available as a resource, and I think that's just an absolute gift, if you're writing about the Victorian period particularly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Beth Ann, for that question. We've got another question from Philip. Again, could be to both of you. What do you enjoy the most, the research or the actual writing?
It depends what day you ask me, to be honest. Probably whatever I'm doing, I prefer the other thing. I think that's what I would say. I don't know about you, Alice. What do you think about that?
I do love the research, but it would make no sense without the writing. So I've been researching now for coming up for 3 months, and I'm desperate to start writing. So the writing is the most important thing, but because I write historical fiction, the research is essential. And because I love the research, I write historical fiction. So that's a bit of a circular thing. But yeah, I wouldn't sit around doing all the research if I wasn't going to write a book. I'll be honest. It's great, but I wouldn't do it, unless I was actually producing something.
I think I feel the same, because there comes a point where I just want to kind of animate it. I want the thing I've learned, I want to put into the mouths of my characters, so for them to have a row about it, or for it to matter in whatever they're trying to investigate. It's like a sort of, it's activating it, turning it on, putting the spark to it, and that's always very exciting. And I always think that that's a really good sign. If I've read something, I've got this body of knowledge, and then I'm thinking, oh, I can see, not in a sort of tangible way, but I can see it's here in this computer document, and here it's going in this story, and I can almost see it zipping past me in front of me like electric, and that's really exciting. But of course, the thing about research-based writing, whether that be historical fiction or if contemporary fiction, but it's about a particular topic, or science fiction and you're researching lots of scientific ideas, whatever it might be, is that you can hang on to the research like a crutch, like, oh, I'm just not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. Oh, I've got to get these other 18 books out of the library, and watch these 55 YouTube videos. I couldn't possibly start. And it's so easy to stay in that kind of safe research area before you actually have to commit to the page and the pure horror of the blank page. So
yeah, do you feel you've got better at that as time goes on? I mean,
no.
Because I definitely think I have.
Oh, I mean, good. It's hope for me yet.
I've published 6 historical novels, and I've written 7, and I think by now I've got a better feel for when to stop.
Yeah.
But also my characters are starting to speak to me now and to each other, and I'm thinking I've got to start writing this down, because they're there now. Because all the while I'm doing the research, I'm thinking, and while that's happening, then they're going to be doing this, or, oh gosh, I've got to have that featuring because that means this will trigger this in them. And they've started, it's now that spark that you talked about has been ignited now. So, I mean, yeah, I've got a few more things to do. I've got to go and talk to some archivists. But then, yeah, by the end of October, I should be writing. But I'm already writing in my head.
And is that, have you given yourself that deadline? Well, not deadline, but you said that very firmly. By the end of October, I will be writing. And is that because you've made that pact with yourself and your editor, or that's just, you just kind of know that you're getting there?
A bit of both.
Okay.
Bit of both. I think I've been able to make that pact with my editor and my publisher because I know roughly how long it takes me to get a real handle on things. I mean, the research never stops. All the while you're writing, you're researching. I mean, you know, you'll have your character doing something. Like I remember when I was writing None So Blind, I had Harry taking out an orange and peeling it with a penknife. And I was like, oh, okay, whoa, hold on. Where orange is free.
Yeah, where do you get that orange?
Exactly. And penknives, when did they start folding up? When did, you know, so that was like, I don't know, certainly several hours research just in the middle of the day while I was writing that book. So the research never stops.
Because of course, things like that, you cannot really foresee that they're coming out. They're going to come out of the story to meet you. I mean, I often find that when I have characters go to light something, to strike a light, to make a light, it should be very easy. They come in, it's dark. How are they doing that?
Yes.
And actually it just so happens that in that period they were moving towards matches as we would recognize them, but not quite. Would they really have had them on this farm in 1844? I just don't think so. What was she doing? And that could take me ages thinking about light. It's a particular bugbear. So I almost now, I think I've got scenes where they're just probably in the dark, you know, because I just get them in there and they're bumping into stuff, make that part of the scene, because sometimes the business of light, but of course most readers aren't stopping to think, well, hang on a minute, what did she use, what she picked up there? But for me that's a kind of a strange stumble, and it represents something I'm just never quite confident about, because I can't quite track it down, because no one's talking in the documents about, well, this is how we struck our light, because it doesn't matter.
No, again, you've got to, I find you go back to the adverts. When did they start advertising matches? So they had it, I think they'd invented them in the time you're writing about, but they were in more common use by the time I'm writing. But again, they were expensive, so only the early adopters had them. But yeah, exactly. I mean, light and heat and wandering around in the dark on horseback. I mean, all those things, they're so big in the 19th century, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely. And I think people's, that question of how much light they had, when they had it, what time of day, is a big thing about how long people's days were. So if you couldn't afford candles, your day was much shorter in terms of what you could actually do. Absolutely. And that's a really big thing in terms of social class and employment and leisure time and all those sorts of things. So it's both a small thing, how does she like the room, but it's also enormous in terms of what else it says. And I find that at points frustrating, like, oh my God, there's an abyss here. And also like, isn't this interesting that this small detail actually blows up so much?
And it can tell you so much about your characters, about where they belong, about their resentments. Oh, why haven't I got enough money to afford matches?
They're burning all the candles in here.
Absolutely, yes. And what were the candles made of?
Yes.
And,
did they smell?
Exactly. And because I remember thinking, right, what was lamp oil like at the time? And there was a real distinction between fish oil, which stank, and spermaceti, which was lovely and didn't smell and provided much brighter light. And again, we're talking about people who couldn't afford much had the stinking fish oil, and the people who had more money had spermaceti. It's fascinating because we don't have that now. Electricity is electricity is electricity. So
yes,
all
exactly.
These distinctions that come through everything that you're using. So fascinating.
It's a minefield, isn't it? Oh, fantastic. We've got time, I think, for two more questions, if that's okay. Winnie has asked, how difficult is it not to be
it is hard. I think it is. Again, I think it comes back to, I mean, you can fall into anachronism at just a pure mistake, an error. It happens, of course it does. But then you've got that bigger question of anachronistic, and the anachronism, is it factually incorrect or is it just a perception? And I'm very mindful of the latter, thinking about the power of historical fiction to reveal the history of people who aren't in the historical record, so who aren't in the whose voices aren't in the newspapers, who aren't recorded in autobiographies, whatever it might be. So historical fiction has a really powerful role to play in helping us understand more about the past. So, a big thing would be, the history of people of colour in Britain, before the Windrush generation arrived. Historical fiction can be so powerful in helping us understand the plurality of history and experiences of individuals who are actually marginalised. But you go into historical fiction thinking, yes, right on, I'm going to do this. But that can be met with a charge of anachronism, which is itself very political. And, that's an important conversation to have, but it can be very revealing as well. So I think anachronism is an interesting word. This is a very long-winded answer that can be used in different ways in historical fiction. And sometimes it's kind of neutral and other times it's not. And that I'm aware of that, and that's interesting, I think.
Can I just talk a bit about anachronistic language? I mean, I'm always looking up phrases and things that, would people have said that then? When did that phrase come into being? And sometimes you think, actually, yes, this phrase I want to use was in use then, but it sounds so modern, don't use it. Because even though it's accurate, it'll pull people out of the moment because they think, oh gosh, no, that's got to be a 20th century thing. And you don't want people thinking, oh, that can't be right. Because you can't really explain. I mean, I was talking about explaining how people might have got the wrong impression about the 19th century earlier on. But you can't have characters saying to each other, oh, well, when did people start using that phrase then, Johnny? So there are lots of lovely phrases which I've discovered that were perfectly, available at the time, but I've had to decide I'm just not going to use that because people will think, that it wasn't current at the time. So it's always a balancing act, isn't it?
Definitely.
Brilliant. I've got one final question. Okay. It's from Gwyn in Swansea, and he asks, do you use theatre plays as a source for your writings of historical fiction, and in particular the mystery genre?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, Alice, you've written plays, haven't you? So
yeah,
it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this.
No, is the honest and very quick answer. I don't. Possibly I should. I mean, I'm certainly looking at the theatre a lot in my research for my current series, but not in terms of the kind of matter of the plays, if you like, just who went, who was in plays, who attended plays, what was the whole culture around that like. I think plays are such a different genre, such a different medium that actually it's quite difficult to have any kind of crossover at all. Plays much more immediate. They don't allow for much elaboration in the way that novels do. You've got to get in there, make your point, leave. So no, I don't see a lot of crossover, but I'm sure that's just me. How about you, Kath?
No, I'm the same, but it's interesting. You've reminded me with this question, Gwyn, so thank you, of a deleted scene in Falling Creatures, because the murder that is at the heart of this story was very famous locally. Lots of people were talking about it and speculating, and it had lots of very gratuitous detail. It became very popular for kind of improvised street theatre. So people would, I think, put on just sort of almost like pop-up plays in which they would act out what was supposed to be the story of this murder. There was somebody locally who was thought to have done it, and he was arrested. And so there were there was a performance angle of this murder, which I did write about, and I did have my characters witnessing this play, this version of the story. And that was how a lot of people, if they weren't reading the newspapers, because many people couldn't read in that, at that time, they were being given a version of the story acted out in front of them. And that happened quite often. And actually, with the rise of in the Victorian period, you've got this what seems like an explosion of murder. It wasn't really, but it was reported on more, and we have the police force, as we would recognise it, comes into being. We've got the detective force. So this idea of like murder in public consciousness was much more prevalent. So there was an awful lot of these kinds of performances of local crimes, which were very gory and problematic in all sorts of ways. But it's an interesting aspect of crime in the kind of Victorian consciousness, I think. So that's where I connected with that. But I think that it would be interesting to look more at plays from the period. But it's another way to think about language, isn't it? And spoken language, and how people actually spoke for writing dialogue, I think is a great resource.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, can I just say a really big thank you to you both for a fascinating talk this evening. It's been absolutely brilliant. And also thanks to everyone at home for joining us, popping some questions in the comments and supporting this event. Just before we go, just time for me to say, keep an eye, as Katherine mentioned earlier, on crime.cymru for news of all their future events, festival news next spring. Sounds really exciting. And also keep an eye on your local library service social media channels. Today was really the start of a rolling season of content provided by Crime Cymru with support from Estyn Athlan, which is a Welsh Libraries digital project. It's called Partners in Crime. It begins next Monday, and it's 5 weeks of rolling releases, including online author talks, presentations and workshops, all by the Crime Cymru Writing Collective. So keep an eye out for that. So thanks once again. And all I need to say now is nos da I chi gyd. Good night to you all, wherever you are.
Good night. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Matthew.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks everyone.
Matthew. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.